What happens after 50 years in San Quentin? Untold stories of lifers. Life behind bars. For some men, a prison sentence isn't measured in years, it's measured in generations. At San Quentin, there are inmates who entered these walls before the moon landing, before modern parole laws, before many of the guards supervising them were even born. They've lived through decades of lockdowns, reforms, riots, executions, and policy shifts, all without knowing if they would ever leave. This is what happens after 50 years inside San Quentin, and what life looks like when a prison sentence becomes a lifetime. If you value deeply researched, factual prison documentaries like this, support Life Behind Bars by liking and subscribing. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that rarely get told. San Quentin and the meaning of a lifer. San Quentin State Prison is California's oldest operating prison, opened in 1852. Over more than a century and a half, it has housed every category of inmate, but none more enduring than lifers. In California, a lifer is an inmate serving a sentence of life in prison, either with the possibility of parole or without it. For many, that sentence began in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, during an era when parole was rare, rehabilitation programs were limited, and sentencing laws were far harsher than today. Some lifers arrived at San Quentin in their late teens or early 20s. 50 years later, they are elderly men inside a prison built for younger bodies. The first decades, survival over rehabilitation. For long-term inmates, the early decades are about one thing: survival. Court records, oral histories, and academic studies confirm that earlier eras at San Quentin were marked by overcrowding, racial tension, and limited mental health support. Many lifers entered a system where violence was common and parole hearings offered little hope. In this environment, inmates adapted or disappeared. Some joined racial or prison-based groups for protection. Some withdrew entirely. Some accumulated disciplinary violations that pushed parole even further out of reach. Rehabilitation, when it existed, was secondary to endurance. Watching the world change from behind bars. After 20, 30, then 40 years inside, time stops feeling linear. Former inmates and correctional educators have described lifers learning about world events through radios, newspapers, and brief television access. They watched the end of the Cold War, the rise of the Internet, September 11th, changes in civil rights law, shifts in sentencing reform, all while living under the same daily routines they'd known for decades. Many lifers outlived their parents, siblings, and childhood friends, confirmed in parole testimony transcripts where inmates list next of kin who have already passed away. For some, the outside world became theoretical. Aging inside a prison built for the young. After 50 years, incarceration becomes a physical challenge. Public health studies and corrections medical reports show that elderly inmates experience accelerated aging due to stress, limited mobility, and long-term confinement. Common documented issues include chronic illness, reduced mobility, vision and hearing loss, cognitive decline, increased medical dependency. San Quentin, like many older prisons, was not designed for geriatric care. As a result, older lifers often rely on fellow inmates for daily assistance, a phenomenon documented in corrections oversight reports and prison healthcare studies. The psychological weight of a lifetime sentence. After half a century inside, identity changes. Psychologists who have studied long-term incarceration note that many lifers stop identifying with their crime, not because it disappears, but because their entire adult life has been shaped by confinement. Parole hearing transcripts show inmates often speaking about responsibility, remorse, personal accountability, growth over decades, acceptance of uncertainty. For some, hope becomes conditional. Not hope of freedom, but hope of meaning. Teaching. Mentoring younger inmates. Participating in restorative justice programs. These roles are documented in program records and educational initiatives operating inside San Quentin. Parole after 50 years. Rare but possible. For decades, parole for lifers was exceptionally rare. But policy changes, court rulings, and sentencing reform in California have altered that landscape. Public records confirm that elderly lifers, especially those convicted as young adults, may now receive parole consideration based on demonstrated rehabilitation, decades of clean disciplinary records, age-related risk reduction, participation in educational programs. Even then, parole after 50 years is not guaranteed. Some are granted release late in life. Some are denied repeatedly. Some pass away before a final decision is made. Each outcome is documented in parole board rulings, not promises. What happens if they are released? For those who do leave after 40 or 50 years, freedom is not simple. Reentry reports show that long-term inmates face Technological shock, limited family support, health complications, employment barriers, housing challenges. Many transition through halfway houses or supervised release programs. Some describe freedom as overwhelming. Others say prison prepared them, in ways the outside world no longer can. Life after decades of routine. After 50 years inside, routine becomes survival. Former correctional staff interviews, parole transcripts, and prison education reports all describe the same pattern. Long-term lifers structure their lives around predictability. Wake-up times rarely change. Movements are deliberate. Conversations are measured. For many lifers, routine replaces freedom. It provides stability in an environment where uncertainty once dominated every day. This isn't preference, it's adaptation. Psychological studies on long-term incarceration confirm that inmates serving decades often develop strict personal schedules to manage stress, anxiety, and the loss of autonomy. Becoming institutional memory. After decades inside San Quentin State Prison, lifers become something unique within the prison ecosystem. They become living history. Program facilitators and prison educators have documented that long-term inmates often serve informal roles as mentors to younger prisoners, conflict de-escalators, teachers in literacy and self-help programs, cultural memory keepers of prison history. Some lifers can describe riots, lockdowns, executions, and policy changes that newer inmates only know from stories. In parole hearings, commissioners frequently reference this longevity, noting how an inmate's institutional behavior over decades weighs heavily in later decisions. The body keeps the score. Time inside doesn't pause the body. Corrections healthcare audits and academic research show that inmates over 60 often present medical conditions similar to people 10 to 15 years older on the outside. Documented issues include heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, limited mobility, chronic pain, cognitive decline. Prison environments accelerate aging due to constant stress, limited movement, and decades of institutional living. Medical care exists, but it is reactive, not designed for long-term geriatric care. This reality appears repeatedly in healthcare oversight reports tied to California prisons. The parole hearing after half a century. For lifers, parole hearings are the most psychologically intense moments of incarceration. Parole board transcripts show that hearings after 40 or 50 years are fundamentally different from early reviews. Questions focus less on the crime itself, and more on insight and accountability, behavioral consistency over decades, risk assessment tied to age, psychological evaluations, release planning, realism. A single disciplinary violation from decades earlier can still surface, but so can decades of clean conduct. Parole remains discretionary. Even after 50 years, release is never automatic. When hope becomes conditional, long-term incarceration changes the definition of hope. Interviews and psychological evaluations show that many lifers stop hoping for freedom in the traditional sense. Instead, hope becomes being useful, being trusted, being heard, leaving a legacy inside. Teaching classes, writing memoirs, mentoring at-risk inmates. These acts are documented in prison education and rehabilitation program records, and often referenced favorably in parole decisions. For some lifers, meaning replaces expectation. Facing the outside world after 50 years. For those granted parole after decades, freedom can be disorienting. Reentry studies confirm that long-term inmates struggle with modern technology, transportation systems, healthcare, navigation, social isolation, decision overload. Many leave prison with no surviving immediate family. Some enter supervised housing programs designed specifically for elderly parolees. Reentry success varies, but recidivism among elderly lifers is statistically low, a fact confirmed in multiple public safety studies. Those who never leave. Not every lifer walks out. Public mortality records and corrections reports confirm that many inmates serving life sentences die in custody, decades after their original conviction. Some pass quietly in medical units. Some die before a final parole decision. Their names rarely appear in headlines, but their lives shaped the institutional culture for generations of inmates who came after them. Transformation over decades. What the records actually show. After 40 or 50 years inside San Quentin State Prison, change, when it happens, is slow, layered, and documented. Parole transcripts, psychological evaluations, and program participation records consistently show that long-term lifers who reach late-life parole consideration often demonstrate measurable transformation over decades, not months. This transformation is not defined by words alone. It is documented through sustained disciplinary-free records, decades of program participation, educational achievement, peer mentorship roles, consistent psychological evaluations. Parole boards repeatedly emphasize one factor above all others: consistency over time. Short-term improvement is viewed cautiously. Long-term behavioral stability carries weight. Education as a lifeline, not a privilege. Education records from San Quentin show that lifers make up a disproportionate number of long-term program participants. Many earned GEDs decades after incarceration, college credits through correspondence certificates in counseling, anger management, and restorative justice facilitator roles in peer-led programs. Corrections education reports confirm that long-term inmates are often the backbone of prison education programs, not because of privilege but because of reliability. They stay. They finish. They teach others. This pattern appears repeatedly in program outcome documentation. Restorative justice and accountability. Restorative justice programs inside San Quentin have been widely documented through academic partnerships and nonprofit reporting. Participation records show that many lifers engage in victim impact awareness programs, accountability-focused group dialogue, long-form personal responsibility workshops. Psychological evaluations submitted to parole boards often reference these programs, not as evidence of forgiveness but as evidence of insight. Parole transcripts consistently distinguish between minimization of harm, acceptance of responsibility, understanding long-term consequences. The latter carries significantly more weight. Remorse is not assumed, it must be demonstrated repeatedly, over time, and under questioning. Identity after a lifetime inside. After half a century, identity becomes complicated. Longitudinal prison psychology studies show that many lifers no longer define themselves by their crime, yet they do not deny it. Instead, parole evaluations describe a shift toward personal accountability without self-erasure, acceptance of irreversible harm, focus on present behavior, commitment to nonviolence. In hearings, inmates are often asked the same questions they were asked 20 years earlier. What changes is how they answer, and whether those answers align with decades of documented behavior. The rare grant. When parole is approved. Public parole board decisions confirm that parole grants after 40 or 50 years do happen, but they are rare and heavily scrutinized. When granted, decisions often cite advanced age, low actuarial risk, extensive positive institutional history, realistic release plans, demonstrated insight. Even after a grant, release is not immediate. Decisions can be reviewed. Conditions can be imposed. Release dates can be delayed. Every step is documented. Freedom, even when approved, is procedural. The weight of denial after decades. Not every long-term lifer is granted parole. Denial decisions, publicly summarized in board records, often reference insufficient insight, incomplete accountability, inconsistent narrative, unresolved risk factors. For inmates who have waited decades, denial can feel final. Some continue programming. Some withdraw. Some never receive another hearing due to age or health. The record shows no single outcome, only individual determinations. Legacy inside the walls. Whether released or not, many lifers leave a legacy inside. Program reports and staff testimony describe long-term inmates as stabilizing influences, cultural anchors, violence de-escalators, mentors who prevent younger inmates from repeating mistakes. These contributions do not erase crimes, but they are recorded, acknowledged, and often referenced in parole consideration and institutional assessments. The final years inside. After 50 years, incarceration enters a final phase. Corrections, healthcare audits, parole records, and public oversight reports confirm that many lifers spend their last years navigating chronic illness rather than discipline or conflict. Daily life often revolves around medical appointments, medication schedules, mobility limitations, assisted movement within housing units. At this stage, risk assessments change. Age becomes one of the most significant factors in evaluating public safety concerns, a reality reflected in parole board language and actuarial tools used in late-life reviews. For many lifers, the prison becomes less a place of punishment, and more a place of managed decline. Hospice and end-of-life care. Publicly documented hospice programs inside California prisons show that some lifers receive end-of-life care inside the institution. Oversight reports and nonprofit partnerships confirm that these programs often rely on specially trained inmate caregivers, medical staff supervision, palliative care protocols, family contact when permitted. These caregivers are frequently lifers themselves, men who have spent decades inside and now help others through their final days. This reality appears in medical program documentation and has been acknowledged in legislative hearings. It is one of the least visible and most human aspects of long-term incarceration. Medical parole and compassionate release. For some inmates, release comes not through traditional parole, but through medical or compassionate review. California law allows for medical parole in cases where inmates are permanently incapacitated and pose minimal public safety risk. Public records confirm that these releases are rare and highly regulated. Approval requires medical verification, risk assessment, administrative review, victim notification where required. Some lifers leave prison in wheelchairs or hospital beds. Others are denied due to procedural or statutory limits. Each decision is documented and final. Dying inside after a lifetime sentence. Corrections mortality data confirms that many lifers die in custody after decades inside. They pass away not as headlines, but as case numbers in annual reports. Some had pending parole hearings. Some had been denied repeatedly. Some had never expected release. Their deaths close files, not stories. Yet their presence shaped the culture of the institution for generations, a fact repeatedly acknowledged in staff testimony and internal assessments. What 50 years really means. 50 years inside does not produce one outcome. Records show many paths. Some leave late in life. Some remain until the end. Some transform deeply. Some do not. What is consistent is this: no one enters prison expecting a sentence to outlast half a century. And no system is fully designed for human beings who grow old behind concrete walls. A life sentence isn't just time served, it's time lived. For the men who spent 50 years inside San Quentin, punishment became permanence, routine became survival, and hope took new forms. These are not stories of absolution. They are stories of time, consequence, and endurance, documented, verified, and often unseen. If you value factual, in-depth prison documentaries like this, support by liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching Life Behind Bars.